Thank you. It's so encouraging to see another generation of editors and readers come to John. He has so much to offer, and always new work coming out. I mean, these journals, I didn't know anything about these, and they're absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I think they're the emotional ground of his poetry. And if you know the poetry well, you see lines in the journals constantly that he's pulling out. I knew about John because I was growing up in Lowell, Massachusetts, and I was taking the train into Boston once or twice a week. And I once saw him give a reading in Inman Square in a little cafe. It was Mother's Day, and he read all the poems he'd written to his mother. There were 12 or 15 of them. And I had no idea who he was. And when it was over, I thought to myself, my God, who was that? Boston in those days was a very grim place in many respects. And, for instance, the gay liberation parades in Boston were a really dangerous affair. I mean, and there was a very small group of people who were out there. John, Charlie Shively, Freddie Greenfield, John Mitzel. Charlie Shively burned the Bible in Boston Common during one of these protests, and you can imagine what that meant to people in Boston. The Boston Police Department responded by firebombing the offices of Fag Rag. And behind the state capitol, many copies got burned, and rather than throwing the copies out, Charlie decided to keep circulating them. So you'd go into bookstores and you'd see copies of Behind the State Capitol burned around the edges. And that's the kind of, times they were. And these were really brave people, all of them, and John as well, because they were free. They were truly liberated people because they knew who they were. And John was just such a beacon in those days, and his work. So slowly, I kind of tried to get to know him, and finally I just knocked on his door one day, because in Behind the State Capitol, his address is in there, 44 Joy Street, number 10. So I rang the bell, and he came down, with his pack of Kent cigarettes, and he looked at me, and I explained that I was, a writer and a publisher, and I wanted to meet him. And he looked at me and he said, "You're here to repair the toaster." And I said, "No, I'm not." He said, "You're not here to repair the toaster." And I said, "No, I admire your poetry and I'd like to meet you." And he looked very disappointed. He said, "Can you come back tomorrow?" And I said, "Yes." "What time?" He said, "The same time." So the next day I came back and he invited me up. And of course the first thing I noticed was there was no toaster in the apartment. But we got to know each other quite well. And I really enjoyed hanging out with him because, his work, if you didn't know him, you'd get the impression that he was this overwhelmingly tragic, sad, depressed person. And he wasn't. He was a tremendously fun person to hang around with. He had an incredible sense of humor, extremely witty, very outre, very campy, just an extraordinary intelligence. So he really was a lot of fun to hang around. And he would show me parts of Boston that had sort of disappeared. He really kept Boston alive in his mind and in his poetry. And he was kind of just communicating with angels all the time, and you could pull him back when you wanted to, and then he was out there. And there was this world of poetry swirling around his head, a world of images, and he could just reach out and pull them out. He wasn't always writing, but he was writing a lot. And there was a lot of controversy about the late work from Behind the State Capitol onward. There were a lot of poets like Robert Duncan who thought it was a complete betrayal, and that Charlie Shively was destroying John's reputation as a poet. A lot of people, they were in love with John's, the belletristic quality of his early work. And John was a child star in the poetry world. I mean, he was about 22 when he wrote Hotel Wentley poems, and Mary Baraka reviewed it and said, "Well, this is as good as Howell." And most people of his generation felt that way. So a lot of people saw Behind the State Capitol as a betrayal because he was opening his poetry up to mental illness, to schizophrenia, to all these questions of gender, which were not so pretty. But all those issues are what appeal to the next generation. In that magazine Mirage, Kevin Killian has a brilliant essay called "The Mind and Drag" about John Wieners. And all of these issues, schizanalysis, slowly, the world caught up with John Wieners. And one of the reasons why I loved the late work was that I saw how much joy John got out of it. John was deeply into that work that he was writing. He was deeply invested in it. He enjoyed it very much. He enjoyed reading it in poetry readings. But this was the situation where you had to get a hold of the thing and make a copy of it, because chances were you would never see it again. And I always said editing John was just a matter of getting to the wastebasket before he did. So, but all through the later years when he was writing these very disjointed poems with no ostensible meaning, I always wondered if he could write poems like he used to write. And you know, I once asked him about it, and why he stopped, why was this sudden break in his work? And he said, well, I felt that exhausted my subjects, and it was better off at that point to just stop writing that way. And Robbie Dewhurst said last night, well, you know, he wrote 600 great lyric poems. It's not like he didn't leave us anything. But I always wondered if he could write in the old style if he wanted. And one afternoon, we walked through the Boston Common and we went down to the Esplanade, and it was a beautiful sunset on the Charles River. And then we went back to his apartment, and I saw him in his bedroom writing, and then he took the piece of paper and he slipped it in a book. And later, when he wasn't looking, I looked at the paper, and he'd written this poem, and it kind of went back to the old style, and it's called O Reeve by the River. What kind of poem would one write if one could? What would one do with some money if he had it? Perhaps to travel, but to where? To experience Wednesday twilight immediately after dark. Is that a promise to be kept? Naturally, one can't be sure until any of these things don't come true. A little denouement before the fact. And then this other poem, he was visiting me in New York once, and we were sitting at the breakfast table, and I was working on a manuscript for a book. I had a meeting that morning, and I was trying to get things done, and John was sitting there talking to himself, and he was really getting on my nerves, and I was about to say, John, would you please shut up? When I thought, wait a minute, why don't you just listen to what he's saying? So I started to listen, and I realized he was reciting a poem. He was just making it up. And if I had started writing it down and he saw me, he would have stopped. So I pretended to just continue to work on what I was working on, and I wrote down what he was saying until he did see what I was doing, because he saw everything, and then he stopped. And later that day I typed it up and I gave it to him, and to see what he would think of it. And he titled it with a ballpoint pen. He titled it Charity Balls. I had a fellowship but lived poorly on slices of pizza. Later a career of washing lettuce. But I have always been the same. It's a question of acquiring a mastery of tone beneath the crystal chandeliers and champagne on a glass tabletop. At the age of 5, I thought Scarlett O'Hara a fictional character. It was not until the age of 48 I knew she was real. Old clothes and bedroom slippers and a scarf wrapped around her head in low-cost tenement housing. She began talking about my writing and her sex life. I'm curt by nature and dolorous, but I knew if I worked hard, I'd eventually make it.